But Sunday,
That was the key.
we did something so easy.
You're gonna do this. I'm not gonna go there. You're gonna go to that meeting. I'm not
So
going.
are you introducing or?
Oh, I thought that you were introducing, but it's.
Have it on the calendar as you.
I can say like, right, I don't.
I assume we got you. It's good to see you. Welcome. I assume you're a stamp for your
Having me.
says that.
No,
It came together.
But I know sometimes like the spring is.
I know you don't want to.
I'm gonna do it, and like I said, I thought, well, maybe I should just do a different,
don't need it.
and then.
We have more. I'm looking forward to dinner too, and just thank you for being flexible. For bearing with us.
File this year's role, and then if you use this.
Sure. Yeah, I'll pull up the.
I haven't kept up. I mean, no, he was.
I don't wanna wait too long because it is after 12 and I wanna make sure we have all the time that we need.
Canes-Wrone.
Yes, that's
Thank
correct.
you.
Thanks for talking. Welcome, everyone. Happy Monday. I feel like it's officially spring. The weather seems to be threatening with us a little bit. Thank you for joining us today. As you saw, there's food in there. Please feel free to refill your plate. Welcome. I'm gonna let Scott do the official introduction, but I also just want to remind everyone, right? General, right, we're gonna have our about 40 minutes of presentation and then questions that will be generally we often moderate, so you don't have to pay attention to who's raising their hands. So I'll be happy to do that.
Okay.
And also just remember a space for sort of respectful contestation questions here today. All right, Scott's gonna take away the official introduction.
The online colleagues visit, are they all right?
Yes, I will keep an eye on them. Can everybody hear us online?
Raise your hand if you're not.
I don't see anything.
No, that's because I minimized it so I could see my slides.
Yeah.
They were,
There are some folks that are.
let's see, so
I'm sure we're signing the right address.
Oh, that's my.
I can try to.
There
Oh,
we go.
good. Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure we were signing the right address sometimes. Okay, cool. All right, Scott.
Oh, wait.
To the races. Okay. Well, hey, good to see you all. It's a genuine pleasure to be back here, I have to say. So thank you for giving me the opportunity, Jess, to introduce our distinguished speaker, Brandice. I think this came out of a conversation we had, I don't even know, 6 months ago, a year ago, who can tell at this point? But thank you for following up on that. And for those who aren't aware, Brandice, we're going to be celebrating and responding to her scholarship today, but also just has a really important role in the intellectual community as both at Hoover and at Stanford as directing the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions. So particularly in that vein, obviously aligns very well with a lot of our discussions and our interests here at the Ostrom Workshop. So this is an opportunity to reflect kind of at a lot of levels and hopefully deepen some ties along the way. So Brandice Canes-Wrone is professor of political science at the Maurice R. Greenberg and Maurice Greenberg Senior Fellow at Hoover. During the course of her career, she has published extensively in the areas of political institutions, mass political behavior, political economy, the fun stuff, including books with the University of Chicago and Cambridge, and scores of articles in the leading journals of political science, and a number of other accolades on top of that. The presentation and the paper today, as you see, are campaign contributions and self-reports. How accurate are survey responses regarding donation behavior? Very timely topic with the midterms approaching as well. And we're just could not be more grateful for you to have made the trip from sunny California to increasingly humid Indiana. And without further ado, Brandice, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks so much for having me and being out today. So this is work with Mike Barber, who was a student of mine before I moved to Stanford when I was at Princeton, and is now tenured at BYU. And then Luca Bellotti, who's is a postdoc with me at Stanford currently, and has a professor position at Yale. So you're always happy to see your students. So he'll be leaving, mostly happily, well, happily for him and mostly happily for me. Skip. I should have checked the, yeah, I'm kind of pushing it down, but let's see what to, how to.
Maybe
Here we go. Wait, nope.
Press.
Much for that.
Right on that. Also not working?
Maybe if we get rid of that X.
Oh,
Wait,
that's up there.
that's up there. I see. Well, maybe
Disconnected.
if we do get rid of the X here. Remember it all?
Because it was working before. Okay.
All right.
Okay, so that's what it was. Thank you.
No, no,
So much.
no.
Okay. So, some of you, if you work with data such as, what was then the CES, now called the CES, the Cooperative Election Survey, or of course, the American National Election Survey. And you look at these items on donors, and actually a nice thing is the ANES, they've been asking this question for decades, which is something I'll get back to during the talk, not just in 1992, but even earlier, going into the 70s. You look at those, it seems like a kind of fairly large proportion of the country is donating in political campaigns. So in recent campaigns, close to 20% of the public. Meanwhile, the FEC data suggests that, around 2 to 3% of the public is donating. Now, you don't have to report, the campaigns only have to report donations if people have given above $200. So one possibility is there are all these small donors out there. There are reasons to be suspicious of that because over time, as online donating has become more popular, it's just become difficult for campaigns to distinguish, right? Before it was work for the campaigns to take a check that came in the mail and log it in and report it. Now it's actually more work to have to remove you from the automated lists of donors. So in fact, I think a lot of people are unaware that when they give $25 or $5, that information is typically, we'll get into how typically it's reported, I guess, in these estimates, but that is often reported. We know that often those donations are reported, and that's particularly the case if you're donating through Act Blue or Win Red. Those are reported. So reasons to be suspicious, but we don't know. And so that's what this talk is focused on. And I'll get at this in the final slide. One of the larger research questions we're interested in is using those ANES self-reported donations over time to look at whether congressional members have become more responsive and or more congruent with donor opinion over time. But to do that, we're going to have to use, in that case, these self-reports, since we can't go back in time, and have, surveys of living donors in real time. And so the question is, how good are these self-reported estimates? Is it this kind of worthwhile, or do we think that sort of they're so messy that basically there's a reason no one has done, such a study? So I'm going to talk a little about the literature on self-reported political participation in general, as well as on donations, give a little bit of a brief primer on political giving, which I give credit, Luca reminded us, we had to acknowledge that even people who study American politics, and even of those who are from America, often don't know. I've given talks at law schools where often faculty who study campaign finance law seem surprised when, you could be informing them about some of the rules. So it'll be very brief, but just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. Then what we've done is an original survey of validated donors. I think we think of that as our primary contribution. So we know who is a donor in the survey, and then we have comparison samples. Here we'll be focused on our comparison general population sample, although we also, for different research purposes, have a comparison sample of affluent. That's for kind of doing some other types of policy preference comparisons and political priority comparisons among kind of a sample that at least ex ante might be more similar in socioeconomic status. Then we've also conducted a list experiment. And we do it twice for reasons I'll get into on separate survey samples on this question. We know list experiments, it seems like they were really, really hot and then they're not so hot, but there's never, it isn't as if they're never done. And this just seemed like one of these areas where it could be particularly useful. Then what we're going to do is compare the demographics and policy preferences of self-reported versus validated donors, since those are two commonly studied questions that use the self-reports, and then talk about some implications and conclusions. Okay, so here's the brief primer of political giving. So so individual donations are now the largest share of campaign contributions to federal candidates. So in the 90s, 1990s, early 2000s, a pretty robust literature on PACs, political action committees. And at that time, particularly for incumbents and especially in the House, PACs dominated campaign finance. But over time, individuals, particularly with the shock of the internet, and online giving, individuals start to overtake, and now they eclipse, and even for House incumbents are the largest, although that's around parity, that's closer, and PACs remain important. But for challengers, for Senate incumbents, here we're focused on Congress, but for presidential candidates, individuals are really where it's at. So the Federal Election Commission, I noted you have to report anything above 200, or if your source aggregates above 200, since probably as many of you know, you get this you can give $20 every few months, that sort of thing. So you have the donor's name, the mailing address, the employer, occupation, the date, and the donation amount, and then not required to report these smaller donations. And I've already mentioned these intermediary platforms that have become quite influential, and where you receive them and then you pass them along. You choose the candidate, the donor chooses a candidate, and usually these are disclosed. Again, kind of just for ease. Okay, so kind of a large literature broadly construed, and then a very small literature on this specific topic. So there's a growing literature on sort of analyses of donor behavior and characteristics, and that uses a range of types of measures. Many of those use self-reported. Going back, I should actually note that the VRBA, I was sort of in this, I don't know if pleased is the right word, but kind of intrigued by the fact that VRBA, Schlossman, and Brady have estimates that are pretty similar to the CES and ANES in terms of self-reported donations, suggesting that, kind of very different sampling strategies and approaches, and pretty different era even get similar estimates. The self-reports are used in participation scales. They're the standard measure. So anytime you see this, these scales that add up, did you volunteer in a campaign? Did you have attend a meeting? Those use self-reported donations as well. And these are just some of the many studies that use those participation scales. There's a big literature as well on over-reporting of voting. Sorry. So we know people want to say they vote, right? And that's established. It's not clear that would happen for donating, right? So I think one reason people haven't looked at it is harder to validate than vote, right? Better measures of validated vote. But another reason would be, you could say, unclear. So there's evidence that people believe money has a corrupting influence, and there's evidence that people underreport their income and wealth, or refuse to disclose, right? Whenever we do, which I'm sure many of you who do surveys know that when you ask people, to report their income, you lose a bunch of respondents on that question. And on average, those tend to be higher income respondents. So you might think that donating works similarly, right? The people either won't report it or they'll underreport. And then here's the very small part of the literature, which is there are almost no studies that try to get at this. So there's a very nice book, some of you may be aware of it, by Magleby, Goodliff, and Olson, which is about the 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns where they obtained the full donation records from the Obama, McCain, and Romney campaigns. And so they are able to tell for those specific presidential campaigns the list of small donors completely. And they estimate that, you know, there's a lot of over-reporting in those years in terms of who said they donated to the campaigns versus who actually did. Again, in their case, that's not the focus of their study, but they can give an estimate of what proportion of the public did give to the campaigns versus the statistics from surveys such as the CES. And we'll get into the fact that, you know, in their case, for instance, you can, there are questions on the CES that say, you know, did you give to a congressional candidate? Did you give to a presidential candidate? That sort of question. But, you know, I think there are legitimate questions whether people who donate, maybe you donate to a party and you think of that as donating to the president, you know, it's a presidential year. So we're going to try to be careful in our language, which is that we're trying to analyze the accuracy of these measures without ascribing sort of motive to the individuals, right? People may even think that if they donate to a nonprofit organization, right, that is taking a political position, they may think of that as a political campaign, right? Donation, even though it's not, right? Okay, and then Hill and Huber have a paper, pretty recent paper as well, where they attempt to, as best they can, validate the CES self-reported donors, but by design, they use and will make use of this late in the paper on some of these comparisons of demographics and policy preferences as well. When we look at some of the CES common content, what they use as a proxy is a CES question about whether the self-reported donor gave a total of $300. And they claim, well, we think, you know, we think that that's close to, you know, the type of person who would be a validated donor and would have given at least $200. But they can't really, you know, they don't have the survey questions to ascertain that precisely. Okay, so that's what our survey is designed to do. And as I mentioned, it's part of a broader project on campaign finance, where we ask a series of original and then some standard items on donating, as well as on some other issues such as policy preferences and priorities. And there are these three samples of the adult population: donors, the general population, and affluent. And we're going to be, in this talk, focused on the first two, but in the paper, we analyze the results for the affluent as well and have complementary findings. And we always know whether the respondent was a validated FEC donor. And I should have mentioned, this is from the 2017, 2018 midterms. And we're in the field 2020 mostly, a little bit of very late 2019 kind of holiday period into 2020. Yeah, we had some IRB and actually I can tell you our IRB holdup was, so we hired TargetSmart as a vendor of samples. So TargetSmart is a consumer products firm that goes through the FEC donation records and category, you know, and classifies whether everyone in their file is a donor. And they have a very large database that's designed to represent the general population. I have done this with Mike Barber before ourselves, and what we've, you know, I would say that TargetSmart is worth the money, although they weren't faster. You know, when we were doing it, it just, as you may know, the FEC, the data don't really come in until January, February, and they're messy. I mean, maybe now with AI, it'll all be really speedy, but we can always hope that will be a benefit of AI. But certainly pre-AI, it took a long time to clean this and do it well. But the good news is, while they did it at about the same pace we did, which was to get it to us around August after the election, we can get into this later, but we've done a lot of checks of their data and we think they're pretty clean. They seem to do a careful job. And we know that they also sell to congressional members this data. So I mean, I think there's an incentive for them to do it well. We don't have the email addresses. What we have is the postal mail address. So all 3 of our surveys are postal mail contact that are pushed to web. So that we have a comparison, comparable format. We have run some comparison surveys, a little less focused on the validation because we can't validate there, but just to see whether there's something askew with our general population sample on items like policy preferences, and done some kind of different sampling methods. We send a reminder postcard to the half who didn't respond, and we give a $1 contribution to the charity of choice among 3 choices. So in previous, the one that Mike and I did from scratch, really Mike taped the dollar bill, to be fair, as to who did it. You get a much higher response rate, but you lose the dollar every time they don't respond. So we had about a 14% response rate, but that's a lot of dollar bills that go. So this is a more cost-effective way of doing it. But this was actually what held us up at Princeton. The other schools, Yale and Vanderbilt. I should note that the broader survey is also with Greg Huber and Josh Clinton. So Josh is at Vanderbilt and Greg at Yale. They're not on this particular paper, but their schools all signed off quickly. But Princeton had a big issue with this dollar contribution to charity. And actually, maybe they've changed it since I've left, but they then instituted a rule that it was forbidden for anybody to do this. Yeah, I know. I don't. That's what I think. And it was the Red Cross and the American Cancer. These were not politicized. I could understand. And we offered. Finally, they just, I think, caved because of the other schools having signed off. That it just became kind of embarrassing. But they didn't like this dollar contribution to charity. So, anyways, that was why it took us from. It wasn't that, but August to December to get into the field. So truth be told, we maybe it wasn't terrible, but we predicted the response rates a little differently than they came out. We hadn't done it this way with without the dollar bill, and there aren't that many surveys of validated donors. There aren't that many mail surveys. In general, so we underestimated the validated donors, how responsive they would be. So they were, a little less responsive than with the dollar bill, but not that much. I mean, but the general population was not that responsive. So still sufficient for purposes of analysis. So over 1,000, but kind of a lesson learned. And the other thing to note is we were. No. Okay, good. Yeah. No, it stopped again, but wait, let's learned that you have to
That's the control.
you have to, there we go. Yeah, okay. Excellent.
Funny thing, I'm just gonna close your sheet. Steal this and just close this one up.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
There we go.
Okay. So, in general, we were really, really happy with kind of the balance of who responded, with one very big exception, which is that we received a much lower response rate among Republicans than Democrats. So, we have information both from TargetSmart and from, then the self-reports in the that come in, but we know from TargetSmart's data who they have as a registered Democrat or Republican. Again, I'd say we have enough Republicans to do the analysis. We're careful in, we create weights. We do a lot of analyses by party, as you'll see. So we've, done a lot to deal with that. And again, it's not really an end problem, but it's kind of a long-term research issue that we're going to be sensitive to. I had hoped, and this had actually been a thought, that, Josh being at Vanderbilt and Mike being at BYU, that in and of itself would help, and maybe it did. We don't really know the counterfactual, but Josh and Mike reminded us that among Southerners, Vanderbilt, is still seen as of the left among the South. Maybe people from the Northeast think of Vanderbilt as less, and that BYU among Mormons is seen as of the left, I guess, among more, left for Mormons. So, yeah, we'll have to, I've talked to Darren Shaw a bit about this, who's, at UT, University of Texas, Austin, and works with Fox News polling. But this is, we are sensitive to this issue in the analysis and take account of it. And I would say otherwise we do kind of shockingly well in terms of response rates. Like almost, if it's the benefit of the party being forced, that I would almost not, wow, that's really like gender, rate, like all these other things are coming out almost too good to be true. Yes.
This is a small question. Were there difference in terms of age across these groups?
Not a big one. No, that's actually the other parts of it look, yeah, no age, but see, I mean, there are more, and we'll talk about this, like there are more, the age is correlated with being a donor, but conditional on that, our response rate among donors by age is not, those who responded and didn't respond, that wasn't an issue, but it's going to be a sample that skews older because of yeah. Okay, so our key items in the validated donor survey are just this question of whether you gave it all. And for that, we're going to take the ANES and the CES items directly. And I can, if you want, I can show you those. Maybe it's worth, I put them in the SUP, but maybe it's worth just seeing it. So in the ANES, this is a very long-standing question. They asked, did you give to any of the following? This was, there wasn't a presidential race this time. So you're asking about, Congress, state government, political party, or group. And this is again, to just recognize people how people interpret the group. We don't know. What we did is if they said yes to anything, then we went on and asked, did you give over $200? So that we know if they said yes, then they should be in the database. And if they didn't report donating, we asked actually, even if you haven't donated recently, have you ever made a contribution? Again, using the same language of the ANES. Right now, we've kind of put the analysis of underreporting more in the supplemental because the bigger issue seems to be overreporting. But, ex ante, you don't know. And one thought was, you could see a world where people, both because of if they thought social desirability was not to donate, but also just due to misreporting that they forgot they donated this time rather than last time, right? The CES slice is slightly different. This is their question, and they first just ask you this battery of political participation questions, as well as donating blood. So I guess public goods of different sorts. And then again, we kind of follow up with this above $200, as well as whether you've ever, we first just say above, first we say, did you, if you donated, did you donate? This is still the CES itself. They give all these categories. And then we ask based on those categories, more than $200. And as well, even if you didn't, have you ever made a contribution? There, we didn't put it all into the, into the categories. Okay, so those are the items. One, this is kind of in the weeds of this topic, you could say, but one issue that people have speculated on is that there's something, because historically the ANES had, let me go back to that first. Historically, the ANES did have a lower percentage of self-reported donors than the CES by a fairly large amount in the early years of the CES, actually. And so one thought was that the question wording itself or the sampling strategy could be driving this. And so we wanted, it's kind of a subsection, very much a subsection of the paper, but kind of allow that maybe there was something in the question wording. Now they've kind of come together in recent years, and as you may know, the ANES does more online sampling now. So, you know, the sampling strategies are a little more similar, though the ANES continues a face-to-face portion. But in any case, what we'll test is kind of the wording splice component with a very different sampling strategy than either of them. And then, you know, as I mentioned, we have these kind of follow-up questions that you saw over 200 and then didn't give. Okay. So here's what we find just in the kind of first round of results. The first thing is no real significant difference between the ANES and CES question wording. So the question wording itself doesn't seem to be driving. And actually, we didn't necessarily expect that because you'll see the CES, just because it's kind of with this battery of different political participation items, as if, you know, did you volunteer? Did you, you know, things that I think people would see as public goods and even donate blood, even apolitical activity. You might think, oh, this is a good thing, I should be checking. Whereas the ANES has it as a very separate item, right? Did you donate? But it doesn't really seem, in our results, it doesn't seem to make a difference. And we do find that there's a much higher percentage, though, of those, whether it's just any donation, we find a much higher percentage. And I'm just going to, you can see the percentages themselves here. You know, more than, 12 times, 14 times the amount for any donation are self-reporting. You can validate and you could say, well, they could be small donors. But we see that as well with the 200 and plus donations. There's a fair amount in terms of raw percentage terms, a fair amount of over-reporting, a little bit less than, but you know, the upside of that 200 plus donation question is if your goal were to just reduce the number of people who are not donors, you know, from your, if you wanted to get information about donors, you know, you'd go to only around 5% of the sample being sort of unvalidated, we'll just say donors, right? So you would reduce it significantly, even though as a kind of the propensity to over-report is not that much lower than you find, you know, it's just because the base is so much lower in that, you know, in that first, you know, it's so, you know, it's about a quarter of the base that actually gave a 200 plus donation from our sample. But it, you know, we're gonna, I guess the CES has indicated they're likely to add our item. Obviously, this is just a working paper now, but they, you know, they think it could be useful. So that's a nice thing. But it, suggestive, both sets of results are suggestive of over-reporting. So this leads us into our list experiment, which is to see whether that will provide some validation for that claim. So we run it twice. We ran it in the 2020 election in the CES module, and for 1,000 respondents in the pre-election survey. The same respondents answered the direct CES item then, which is given on the post-election survey. So one thing that, you know, ideally we would have put our list experiment in the post-election survey, but we would have put it before the common content item where they were directly asked if they gave. But if you know the CES, it doesn't work that way. Your common content material comes your module material comes after the common content material. So that's why we had to put it in the pre-election survey. So it's, you know, nice at some level because, you know, you could say there's a little bit of an advantage in having it on a completely separate survey. But of course, the disadvantage is that it's being asked about a month to, you know, 3 weeks before the election. Estimates suggest that that's about 20% of donors. So it shouldn't skew our results too much, but this is why we did a second list experiment, because we knew that, and as you'll see, our results are sort of, again, kind of shockingly good from that first one, depending on what you think good is, or shockingly strong, that might be. So it seemed like you kind of needed to do one where, it was done post. So we did one for the 2024 election, and where they answered the list experiment in the same survey first, in the kind of classic format at the beginning of the survey, and then later in the survey, direct question. And we based that on the CES wording, since our first one had been kind of part of the CES. They could be as similar as possible. And as you can see, in the list experiment, there are, the sensitive item is donating, and then we ask about other types of civic and civil activities. Okay, so as I mentioned, very strong results in the first one. Our estimate is from the first one is that 3% of the public is donating, which is really close to the FEC estimate, almost, but then in the CES module that we ran, so these are the exact same individuals who were, of those that completed both the pre and post, 30% said they had donated, which is pretty similar to the CES common content, which of course has many, many more respondents. Kind of in keeping with list experiment, kind of procedural standards we are not including, but it doesn't make a difference in the results. But the reason the sample sizes go down is we're sort of only looking at those who did not receive the sensitive item in the list experiment, prior to being asked the direct question. But we can include them. And as I said, it doesn't change the results very much at all. It tends to shrink the standard errors, as you'd expect. And then in the common content, you get, kind of a similar estimate, and a really big gap. In the 2024 election, interestingly, in the list experiment, we do get a lower amount who are directly reporting. That doesn't seem to be that specific to our sample, because it's actually very similar to what the CES, and again, this is when we run it the second time, we're running it with YouGov. We're not running it with the CES. This is an entirely separate sample. We get very similar to what they do on the direct, but we do get a somewhat higher estimate of the indirect and in the list experiment. The differences, depending on which difference you're looking at, are either kind of marginally significant or a little less than marginally significant. The pooled across the two, very significant. We interpret this as all of it's in the direction of over-reporting. Although, and the difference, having said that, this 12% looks a little higher. It's actually not, statistically different than the three, when you run it, they're not statistically different from each other. So we interpret all of this as saying, there's over-reporting, that there's nothing that suggests that there's under-reporting. Everything points in the direction. A somewhat noisy estimate in terms of what the true level is, although the true level appears to be much lower than the self-reported level. So, okay. So with that, then we want to revisit self-reported donor inferences in light of over-reporting, since we feel comfortable saying there's over-reporting that's happening. So what we know from self-reports in other work, including the Verba, kind of the classic Verba, Schlossman, Brady, but other more recent work as well, is that donors are more educated, have higher incomes, they're older, they're more likely to be white and male, a number of features. And so we're going to do some comparisons with our data of the validated donors from this validated donor survey, both for all donors and those who gave over $200. The self-reported donors in the validated donor survey from the general population sample. When we get to if you remember, I'm not going to ask you to remember table 1, but there are very few validated donors who, even among self-reported, who in the general population sample, who gave over $200. There's so few that we feel, we do report results in the supplemental, but I mean, you're talking about 40 Republicans. So we feel like it's too small to make a very, and 80 Democrats. I mean, so you're getting to really, you're really from this general population sample with the over 200. So we do have enough when if you gave any amount to look at that and make that comparison. And then we do have the CES 2018 common content. And then we'll again look at all donors, and then we're going to use that Hill, and just for sake of comparison, not claiming it's ideal, but use that Hill and Huber standard of the reported 300 total, since the CES had the item on how much did you give in total. Okay, and so here's what we find. So we have the kind of verified, which is our own. Then we have the self-report from our own, and this is any donation. So for any donation, we can use our self-reported general population and the self-reported in the CES. Basically, the big picture, and we can get into the specific results, is that donors are even more skewed than the self-reports suggest. That it'd be depending, again, you always want to be, I try to not, but if you think that representation among donors is a good thing, it's worse than, I guess, I won't, you try not to be too normative, but you don't think, I remember one of my, I will leave them nameless. This is not about, this is a disciplinary seminar. One of the economists at Princeton, I'm not blaming them, but they came to me once and said, we had been doing some work, this was before this work, but on how kind of donor influence, and their view was, isn't this a good thing? Because, you might think that policymakers listen to no one. So I said, well, I guess if that's your baseline, it's probably good that they listen to someone. But, we were saying, donors are a pretty skewed population. Most political scientists would not say this is sort of great from a representation standpoint. But I said they were starting. It wasn't, they were starting. They thought, I would have just thought they don't listen to anybody. So in any case, very skewed population, more so even. But what's interesting is it's on these demographic factors. When we look at factors such as political interest and ideology here, there aren't significant differences, or there aren't substantial differences. And in many cases, not even statistically significant differences. So they look very similar, the self-reported and validated donors. It's just that but the validated donors are more likely to be white, more likely to be male, more likely to have higher incomes and be more educated, and even more likely to be older, particularly on the Democratic side on age, but even some of the estimates for Republicans suggest are older.
Just a clarifying question. It looks like, from what I can tell, female is just weird in both.
Well, so what we probably should put that as male. So what happens is that everything else is sort of in the way, right? Because it's sort of older, more educated, but then female is more likely to be female. And so we need to flip that. I think we need to put male.
What is the implication here that essentially, that in terms of not making this sound horrible, but like less likely to overwork?
Well, we've done those estimates separately. Yeah. So because there's kind of it is, and actually one thing we're still considering. So, your question brings up, we might want to do this, and is that we've created some of these estimates and because these are kind of group averages of just what are the kind of demographic, averages, means, right, of the two groups we have. And here we can even use the 200 because you're doing it at an individual level, which is who's more likely to overreport on an individual level. We don't, we actually there, like a good example is we find that donors are actually older than the self-report, but we actually find that older donors are more likely to overreport. I mean, which seems like it shouldn't, but because you're moving from this average to these means to the kind of individual level. That was one reason we didn't put it, we're like, whoa, we're spending a lot of time kind of going back and forth at the end of the paper. But I will say, this is the second time I'm presenting this. I presented it about just a week ago at Berkeley, and they all wanted that. They're like, that's more interesting than this to them, who over-report. So maybe we should switch it, or put both in. Yeah. We even though we can do it, and I feel it's okay statistically, we want to be cognizant of the limited number with this 200 and above too. But you can, it's not making kind of mean-based claims. Okay. And then the differences, these are the above 200, and for the most part, this helps, this actually at least shows some of what with the females, that they're there's more of a null here for the gender. In fact, that's the biggest difference between this earlier kind of any donation and the above 200. On the others, everything looks very similar, but on women are the differences seem to go away in terms of the group average biases. But on other demographics, again, it's sort of worse from a representation standpoint than the self-reports would suggest. And then, but on political interest and ideology, they look pretty similar. In some ways, this may not be surprising, because you could think the people who self-report, tend to be, more of a social desirability bias if you have high political interest and you think that it's worth, and kind of in general, you're the type of person who would want to be perceived as a donor. You could see that being similar in political interest and ideology. I mean, not that we knew ex ante, but it's not maybe stunning when you think about it that way. Okay, and then in terms of policy preferences, this is the one that's in some ways nearest and dearest to what I'm interested in because of this wanting to use the NES going back over time. We do have a number of papers that use the self-reports on policy preferences to estimate things like donor ideology, which suggests donors are more extreme, like the kind of well-known Buffumi and Heron paper. How donor ideology relates to donation behavior, and then a paper I'd say just showing, I've used the self-reports as well from the CES, and how donor ideology is associated with congressional behavior. So here we can, again, with any donation, use the validated donor survey in our general population sample and the CES common content. For above $200, we have a few items on our validated donor survey that we can use, and we can again go back to the CES common content. We didn't design our policy preference questions to be identical to the CES, so you'll see as I get there, we're a little more limited when we are there. Okay, so this is in terms of validated and self-reported donors. So this is not using the CES right now. We're just looking at we can compare our questions because we asked them of both populations. So there are the same questions. We put them in the appendix, and a lot of these questions like gun control, minimum wage, I mean, the typical question, we used a format similar to that used by Brockman and Malhotra, although, different kind of specific policy issues that we were looking at, but which has a range of options, 4 to 5 options. And then we kind of normalize it to range from 0 to 1, with the idea that we wanted to allow for extremity of use. So for instance, with gun control, we allow for the possibility that you want to ban all guns, right? But we also allow for the possibility that you don't want any restrictions, right? And so, and then in the middle are these options, banning semi-automatic weapons, background checks, the things that tend to come up on the agenda. One reason we wanted to do this in our survey, not just on gun control, but on minimum wage and other items, is that, often if you're using only 2 questions, it's kind of hard to analyze extremity, right? That you're sort of, right, because you could have higher proportions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the positions themselves are more extreme. So we wanted to allow that, donors maybe actually have, spatially more extreme views. And then we didn't, although we have some items, again, kind of to do some comparability testing that use the ANES 1 through 7 scale. We wanted to look, our preference, and I admit it's partly a preference, but it's others in the literature have wanted this too, was to sort of, sometimes people tend, what does the 1 mean? What does the 7 mean? Particularly on these items that have kind of specific content, right? That aren't sort of spending or something, how extreme are you on a line where it's kind of, so anyways, that's what we did. So I'm just whether you like it or not, that's the way we did it. So that's what we're comparing. What we find overall is that there's not a substantial difference in the policy preferences of self-reported versus verified donors. There are a few exceptions. So Republicans on we might call globalization issues. So Republicans on free trade and immigration limits. The verified donors look actually a little more, you might say, kind of pro-globalization than the self-reported ones. And also on it's not very statistically significant, but we'll see another, it's one of the few we can compare it on, but on environmentalism, you can already start to see a little bit of a suggestive, the standard error is big on the self-report. But in any case, those are the exceptions though. On the whole, the Democrats look very, very similar, and even Republicans on most issues. So we can only look at these 2 issues for the above 200 with the CES because of, and even on any issue with the CES. As I mentioned, we took, so the CES has an item on abortion, which is should it always be allowed under any circumstances? And we had a scale where that was one of the options. So we sort of just could turn ours into a 2-point item for comparison purposes. And then our environmentalism item actually was a series of questions. It was taken more from the CES. So we can make a direct comparison there. And what we see is on abortion, very similar, Democrats very similar on environmentalism, whether it's any or over 200. And then for the Republicans, on the environmentalism, a little bit of a difference, not a huge substantial difference, but a little bit. I mean, so we interpret these findings. I realize there's a little bit of qualitative assessment in that. Our interpretation is that if you have the option of doing a validated donor survey on policy preferences, that's better. We would agree. But overall, the differences are not that large. They're in most cases, they were not even statistically significant, and there are a few exceptions, and they're not substantially large. So you want to be cautious, but they look much better than the demographics. So our big conclusions: overreporting is substantial and statistically significant. You can reduce the sample, the size, the number of overreporters. The percentage of the sample who overreports by asking whether you gave over $200, although you'll eliminate some truthful small donors. So it gets into what's your purpose of conducting the study. And that in using self-reports, these demographic differences are understated. The validated donor population is even more skewed, but the policy differences are smaller. And so this is just kind of our next step, giving a heads up. I like to mention this to people because we've learned that we've learned of at least one other person, not on the donor side, but on other issues is doing something similar. So I'm very, please tell me if you know, so we can be in touch with them. We have very little evidence about how donor opinion has shaped policymakers' preferences over time. It's the CES was first fielded in 2006, so they have these nice kind of matches between policy questions, right, and votes. But a lot of the shocks to campaign finance are happening pre-2006, right? You've got McCain-Feingold, which is happening right around then. So that's not, the shock can't really be captured. The shock of the internet has happened by this point. You get a little bit of pre-Citizens United, but not a lot, if you start in 2006. So what we'd like to do is combine historical survey data from the ANES, which has this donor item, or what we're not just want to do, we're actively in the process of this, and use large language models to bridge the survey questions from the ANES to thousands of votes in Congress. So we've heard that there's at least one person in the field. We assume that probably others are doing this. In some ways, you could say it's a surprise no one has done it, because it's kind of, you'd think, oh, that would be, but now that we're doing it, even with the assistance of both a large team of research assistants and large language models, we're aware of why no one has done it before. But we think this is an area where AI can help. And in some ways my co-authors were flipping out, will we be quote beaten? But I was saying, I mean, really whoever gets it out first, presumably there will be a third and a fourth and a fifth person who will improve on each of our, that these will have, we're going to do the best job we can, and then people will do it better based on, because this is a really big project. And so I think it's better that what we do well, and maybe we leave some parts on the table that other people can build off of. But yeah, we're working on building kind of dynamic measures of congruence between members of Congress's votes and the opinions of donors using the self-reported ANES data, given the largely, I thought, we think positive findings of the paper on that. But please tell us if you think we're wrong, because we're going to publish the self-report paper first, so we're certainly not, that's going to be kind of out there. And then estimating general population constituents opinions using MRP in the states, and copartisan constituents. So anyways, that's another talk, but thank you for listening so attentively, and really look forward to your questions.
All right, I am going to start the queue, as is tradition. If there are any graduate students who'd like to ask the first question, be great. Cold call anyone though.
No.
All right, think on it. Okay, I saw Claudia, Stephen, and Gustavo to start.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I am in the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and we have a lot of colleagues working in the nonprofit sector. And actually, they have done this type of research, and but looking at how social desirability influences people's responses when they are asked, do you donate to a non-profit organization? So I was wondering how this analysis will be different if the question had been not a political party, but a non-profit organization.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we should compare, because our list experiment results to some of that, because we actually looked, I know one of Mike's concerns is he was saying, usually when you do a list experiment, it's about, it would be as if it was undesirable to give to an organization, because a lot of times it's about racism and sexism, and political science. But actually, as we looked through the literature, that was exactly I said, no, people are doing this all the time on, maybe not all the time, but there have been some, very well done studies on charitable giving that suggest people over-report when it's a direct question. But yeah, we should go back and make talk about kind of how the over-reporting compares because I'll confess, I don't remember offhand exactly the level of over-reporting with charitable donations. But yeah, the same methodology has definitely been used for that.
And I was thinking that probably another way to test this is not just to use over-reported, but also under-reported when we are asked, what is the range of your salary?
Yeah.
And that we are given a list of ranges, and when the people tend to choose the lower one, they just, even if it is just for a matter of getting information or for paying a membership in a professional association or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. So I didn't hear focus much on the underreporting because it doesn't affect kind of general population estimates much for us because they're, the true percentage, particularly of the over 200 is not that high. So even if over-reporting is kind of happening at a, healthy rate, it's just not but what we do find there, I'll note, is that people, there is some propensity to underreport. It's not, and it does seem to be associated with income, because we have income not just from we don't have to depend on our self-reports. I mean, you can get into how good is the Target Smart estimate, but Target Smart has estimates of income. So we know we have an estimate even for people who don't report income. But interestingly, people will report, because we had that follow-up item, have you ever donated? And the percent, like the people they do say they've reported ever. So it doesn't seem to be that they think donating ever is a bad thing, right? Which we found kind of interesting. So we couldn't really say, that's another reason we don't make too much about it, because could they just not be, remembering which election they reported in, or you could think maybe they think they don't like the candidates right now, like they don't want to be associated. We don't know. We didn't design, but yeah, I think I definitely think us linking it to the income, because that was definitely our thought going in, that maybe we'd see kind of very, the people, a natural possibility would be that people would be very happy to say that they gave a little bit, but not that they're sort of a larger donor. Yeah.
Thank you for this talk. This is really interesting. I kind of want to pick up on one of the last things you said about like when people would or wouldn't want to be associated with a campaign and donating money. So I'm convinced that there's over-reporting that's compelling. I'm curious about when we would be most likely to see that, and when we would be most likely to see under-reporting. I think if I'm like, in some sense, like I wish you had this data like when Trump was on the ballot. Like, would a Republican talking to other Republicans be more likely to say, well, yeah, I gave to Trump because that's what a good Republican does. But if I'm a Republican talking to someone and I don't know the Republican, I'm like, I didn't give money to Trump, even if I did. And so I'm just curious, like, if there's any way, like one possibility is like if you could use the fact that Win Red and Act Blue automatically report even these small dollar donations, if you could like tease out people who give through those organizations or directly to a campaign as a way of trying to conceal like the fact that I gave money to Donald Trump. I don't know if there's something there, but I just feel like the partisan context may be attenuating or exacerbating the desirability here. Would be a really interesting study, probably a follow-up study, but I think it would be really cool.
Yeah. No. In some ways we wanted to explain our differences in the list experiment, even though they're not, we always have to remind ourselves, well, they're not statistically different. They just look different when we look at them, but that we want to explain them with, we thought with some of those, is there something distinctive about either kind kind of the direct, which we thought was interesting that the direct, because when you ask it in a nonpartisan way, you could say maybe the direct go, that people, if they either are very pro-Trump in 20, or they're very anti, right? So they want to be known as a donor, and then kind of in 2024, right, we know people were, very pro or anti-Trump, but maybe a little less of that. I don't know. We didn't feel we could do it. We didn't feel we could spin it fully.
I guess I also just wonder, like,
Yeah,
you know,
I do think it's
sort of akin to when you go to the dentist and you're like, yeah, I floss every day. Okay. Or you go to the doctor and it's like, I have 1 or 2 drinks a week.
Yeah.
Okay. So like, what if you ask people about political donations? If you could get that one question on a survey that has nothing to do with politics.
Yeah.
So they're not primed with this thing of like, oh, this is about politics and this is like what I should say.
Yeah. No, that's yeah. I mean, basically just we agree, and in some ways, we were surprised because that was our expectation. We thought the CES question splicing would have more, although it is true that with the ANES, you are asked a lot of other political things. So even though it's not in the battery of what else you've done, it's sort of as if you should be interested in politics, right? Because you're sitting, you're getting an 80-minute survey on, politics. So if you're, it is a weird, but in some ways that's what surprised us so much with our YouGov that was independent, because we thought, and I would put, even though our validated donor survey, we worked hard to try to keep it to 20, let's say 25 minutes max. It's a political survey, right? I mean, it's not like everything's about politics. Whereas our YouGov survey, I mean, we hit them with that list experiment first thing. And I mean, maybe we could find out from YouGov, because they're doing lots of other things before they hit them up, but they're really not supposed to be giving them a big put. You're in some ways paying them so that they'll be asking about TV or TikTok or something. Yeah.
It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, but I agree with you. I think that would be kind of thinking about when it's more or less socially desirable, both from an external social desirability perspective and maybe even from an internal, when do you want to self-perceive as a donor as well? Yeah.
I'm tempted to two-finger, but I'm gonna wait. Wait for my turn. Gustavo and then Eduardo.
Okay, so super cool stuff. I think I have 3 comments / questions. So the first one is about potential interpretation is, so because what we have here is over-reporting, no? So what about if the way they are reading the question is, if I was willing to donate, maybe I didn't do it, but I was willing to do it, and then I reply yes in the survey, but then I didn't actually donate, okay? So that could explain potentially, the over-reporting. The second thing that personally is the part that I found more interesting about the paper is that it seems to be here that those that are not donated are essentially free riding those that they donate, because there are no differences in policy preferences. I'm not putting money and others are putting money. So I think that's very interesting. My only comment there is, I was thinking, what is the only possibility that this is generating a political bias for the group as a whole, is that the policy issues that you listed and you check with those questions, those are very important for those that put money, but then those that did not put money, they have the same preferences on those issues, but they have different weights or potentially other issues that they are not appearing, no? It looks unlikely, but that is, from me, it seems to be the only possibility of this generating a biases. Otherwise, it's just a pure free riding, no? And it's very interesting, no? So that essentially, you are not introducing any bias, so you're introducing a bias because of bias preferences by donors. But within donors, it doesn't seem to be a huge bias, okay? And then final comment, and I don't know if you want to go in that direction, is this a call for a more general push to kind of hierarchies in terms of different types of data? So it's like in econ, you have people say, well, credit card data from whatever consulting companies. Okay, I trust because people are spending money on that stuff. Surveys, well, so do we need to start considering some kind of hierarchies of results depending on where the data is coming from? And I don't know much if there is work on that, if this is kind of open the door to something that was not possible to be done, but probably is, again, I but really don't want to go there. Okay, so anyway, so those are really fascinating papers. So it's like those are the three comments that I have.
Yeah, no, thanks. Really, really helpful. In terms of, I like your frame of, even though, my guess is the people who wrote these questions, they asked, did you give? But I think that broadly, you could see people thinking, yes, I mean, because this gets into this internal fact. I see myself as it's maybe part of their identity. I'm the type of person who would donate. I think what you said about the preferences, one thing we have, so in a paper that recently came out in the JOP, and actually I do think we need, we've talked about, should we put in these figures, even though at some level, but not everyone will have read that paper and the general public, like what would the people who don't, or the non-self-reported donors, because they look more moderate in each party, as you might expect, particularly on the domestic issues, they look more moderate. And then on the foreign policy issues, they look less globalist. So it's a little different, but still, they look distinct. You could say the general public is distinct, but as you say, not from the self-reported donors, that they are, the people who sort of want to see themselves as donors but didn't donate. They're the free riders because they're getting, what they want. And I think your question on priorities, so we actually have a separate working paper that's looking on how the priorities of the general public and donors differs in the extent we're kind of interested. We have some open-ended items on how, why did you donate? And, does listing an issue incentivize you? And also in the same paper on confidence. Are donors more confident in their view? And basically they are, and confidence and the importance of an issue, and naming an issue as important can predict whether you donate. We have not looked at, though, which I think would be worth looking at, given your question, kind of the priorities of the self-reported donors who can't be validated. That would be interesting. We have not done, they're kind of been these two separate groups of co-authors, but I think that would be interesting if it looks, it would be interesting either way. Yeah.
You shut down the only possible channel for the free riding story.
Yeah. No. But we haven't looked at the self-report. That's what I was going to say. So they might be that the self-reported, we can see. Yeah. That would be, that would be interesting. Yeah. Eduardo? Yeah.
Thank you again. The one is I have a more like a clarification question and a methodological question. Is it, did I understand it right that independent of the amount of donation, the profile of the donor is the same? So people who are donating $10 or $1, they're the same profile as the ones that you described for over 200, like income, male, white, and so forth.
So we have some results. Let me see if I put it in, or I may not have added it. No, I should have. This was the underreporting. We have run estimates that are sort of holding everything constant, so that it's not more, often when these studies the self-reports are used, they're done in this way that it's kind of individual characteristics. But we have done that. There certainly are some differences between donors who give more than who give less. There's sort of two dimensions to that. There's sort of are there differences in the willing, like what are the differences in validated versus self-reported among people who give more versus less? And one thing we find, for instance, is that donors, this is not on the self-report, which is validated, but on just sort of how do donors differ across the amount they give. We find that small donors actually have more ideologically extreme kind of domestic policy preferences than donors who gave over $200. They both have more ideologically extreme preferences than the general population, but neither of them but the small donors are even more extreme. It's true that the small donors, we have to be a little bit careful. That's one reason we do both, the any versus the above 200. When we can look at just the donors and compare them. And what I'd say is the results are consistent. We haven't kind of highlighted the under 200 because kind of our validation ability is more limited with that group. But the sort of comparisons we report are consistent with what we find. What we can't do, and I want to be upfront about this because and I think this would be a very good follow-up study. We did not sample the data to sort of do a really deep dive on, say, donors who gave over $20,000 to different candidates. It's just not how the sampling was done. And we were actually surprised that of our validated donor sample, almost 50%, so that's of the 7,000 kind of validated donors, about 40, I think it's 46, 48% gave less than $200 total. So this isn't explain who responded more, but it does explain why we have more why the sample 2018 was a Democratic wave, but on top of it, Win Red was not really well established in 2018, whereas Act Blue was up and running. So all those Act Blue donors are in there. So whereas the kind of small Republican donors aren't as in there. So yeah, we certainly don't want to claim that small donors are the same as large donors. But we didn't find large validation differences on this limited issue again, but not on the kind of over 20,000, which I think we would just need to sample very differently.
I do the methodological question now, or
No, go for it. Follow up.
So it's more like to reflect on this experiment. I don't have a lot of experiences there. I have some experiences doing indirect questionnaires, kind of. I find they're very hard to design.
Yeah.
If you could share with us just your experience a little bit of using it, whether you did pre-testing. I mean, just a little bit of experiment.
I mean, we did give a lot of thought to it. I mean, we did some pre-testing. So I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, obviously, given that in some ways and we went back, and I don't know if anyone ever has read Andrew Gelman's blog. So he's, at Columbia, and he's in statistics and political science. There's this whole thing about list experiments. It's people start concluding they never want to do them again. The people who find them. What I would say is we did some pre-testing. We've used the methods, the kind of Blair, we've tried to do the best methods. It definitely, what people don't like is that they feel that they tend, when they run multiple of them, they tend to produce pretty different results. So again, ours are at least not statistically significantly different from each other, but they're a little different when you look at them. So I would say ours fits, and we would certainly be open to, if there's, did try to get feedback on a strong design. And I don't think I would be as pessimistic, not just on the results, but that I think that there is a use for them. But I do realize, I know someone was pressing me that they, the list experiment gets at this social desirability, but it actually doesn't get at this kind of identity aspect. You want to see yourself as, if you sort of want to think you donated. And it also, I will note, again, for its kind of own reasons, it got out. I wish we'd done it earlier, the follow-up. That was kind of what, because we ended up getting into the field in June. And we know from, other research that the further away you get from the event, the less accurate. So this again gets to a kind of people may, how did we get 12%? Well, maybe people donated sometime in the past few years and they thought it had been this election. So, I mean, if I were to say the one thing, was there a way we could have been in there in January? That I think would have been a lot better.
Thank you.
All right, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Which, yeah, I'm gonna take my.
Okay.
So this, I'm sort of, first of all, where are you sending this? Like, is it a methodology journal or a methodology?
I think we were thinking of a generalist journal, but we haven't ruled out sending it to, certainly, we haven't submitted it yet. So we might, we're prepared that people might say it should be in a pure political behavior journal, or it should be so I mean, we're not, or a more methodology journal, but we're, because of the high use of these self-reports, we feel like in some ways this isn't just that they're used in political, but we're, you go into the journal processes, very open-minded at where things might end up. Yeah.
I asked because I was sort of curious if or how much you are wanting to develop a the theoretical.
Yeah.
It seems like there's these really two components, right? So we could either have the externally driven social desirability bias, which you might get around based on how much you think they trust about whether the data is getting out or not.
Yeah.
Right. So if they trust, and this gets to your question, if they trust that that it's going to be posted somewhere and someone might actually see.
Yeah.
Or that they know the person they're talking to.
Yes.
Right. Then they're going to have one kind of bias. But the other would be this sort of internal thing you've been talking about that reminds me of, I think, another paper that I think Huber wrote about this sort of, and we were just talking about this paper, how people respond in surveys, right? If the answer is something that they can get wrong, right? But there's no consequence for getting it wrong, right? They will answer it however they want to because they want to signal the group that they're in to themselves.
Yeah.
Value, right? So that, but once you give them $2 if it's right, $1 if they just say I don't know, and then a 0 if it's wrong, then they're much more willing to say I don't know. Which makes me sort of say, is there any way to sort of help us think about a theory of the voter here?
Yeah.
Reflects that you can use this data to help us say, are they more, or when are they more prone to external social desirability basis as opposed to internal drivers that I think it was Greg's paper, right? On the sort of rallying effect in surveys.
Yeah.
Right. Whereby you want to signal to yourself that being a member of this group matters even more than some true statement of fact about the world.
Yeah.
Right. And then you would have these sort of, and again, like, it really depends on, you say you have a broader project here, so you might already be some of this stuff in that, but I was just sort of curious if you have this opportunity to develop a kind of theory out of this data of how and when these things are operating.
Yeah.
Sort of.
I think I think it's a great suggestion, and I think we can definitely bring up more. I think, originally we were thinking about it as social desirability effects, and we had really, we have a version of it where we'd kind of written it as kind of, over versus underreporting and social desirability versus kind of, not wanting to reveal kind of donations in the way of income and the like. But I agree that actually, in the results, particularly on the list experiment, kind of suggests this internal versus external efficacy. And you could even see, some, I wouldn't want to go too far in what, because we don't offer people money for accuracy. So like, I want to be a little cautious. But one thing that's interesting about having been sort of forced onto the pre-module is, asking someone before the election whether they've donated. At some level, you could still donate, right? It's almost, you could intend to donate, right? Whereas once it's happened, if you want, either, and you might want to, you can't really think of it as, I haven't donated yet, but I'm going to donate, right? You'd have to have donated or not. So, I mean, that would be, the type of thing where you might expect less of this, and I think we could certainly bring up the theory better, and the kind of theoretical issues, and then we could also point the way to future, even if we can't answer it all in the questions that were asked. Yeah.
On the list experiment, it's now traveled. It's being used widely in like reproductive health surveys. I don't know if you know that. It's really interesting in like abortion spaces.
Okay.
Claudia, you wanted the last question? And then
No question, because we are running out of time. This is just for a future research, probably. How all of this research is contingent, and how competitive the elections perceived.
Yeah, no. I think this gets at it, that you might feel you wanted, because there could be two effects. One is you're, you want to feel you supported the person, there's always these, I was part of the winning team, but there can also be this, my team didn't win. I want to think I did everything I could and I was part of the process. And so I do think that that's, that you could see different behavior in a competitive versus uncompetitive in terms of the truthfulness, or accuracy. We'll say accuracy.
Research from my colleagues, I have heard that retired people are the ones that tend to contribute more. First of all,
Yes.
they have more incomes.
Yes, no.
Because they have time to do.
Yes.
So I wonder how in the future, if this could be just a separate group of people that are retired, to see if actually we will have the same reported. Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, we have enough, I didn't look, but we have enough people of, in kind of, of senior kind of, status. And what we've done, again, we can dive deeper on this, but they do tend to over-report, which in some ways we found, I don't know why, but surprising that, because we might have thought that I don't know why we thought they would. We thought, well, they already donated in some ways, as you said, they have time, so they should be less likely to sort of, have meant to donate, but not have donated, but they over-report in kind of healthy proportions. But I agree that diving deeper into it would be really good. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.